All right, welcome to the Notes from Underground podcast. Today we have the pleasure and honor of having Dr. Jack Fuller on as a guest. Dr. Jack Fuller is a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group, currently on the BCG's think tank, writing a book called Competing on Imagination, looking at how imagination lives in business and strategies to keep imagination alive under pressure. He has a degree in neuroscience from Melbourne University and a M.Phil and a D.Phil Ph.D. in Theology and Ethics from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. His doctorate was on Desire and Ethics of Advertising. Previously, Jack worked at the School of Life, where he taught classes every day on philosophy, including procrastinating less, rising ambition, the ethics of ego. And his work on imagination has been presented at the BCG's clients in the US and in Europe. And his work has been published at MIT Sloan Review, BCG Perspectives, The Conversation, the Sydney Morning Herald, and most recently, the Harvard Business Review. So Jack, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks.
Would you like to, is there anything you could fill in the blanks from that intro?
Sure, yeah, I would say, just thinking about my path, it can seem that there's a range of things in there, but something that ties it together for me is that I've always been interested in human nature, like, what's really going on with us, what's inside of us. And so that's why I studied neuroscience initially, kind of from that more philosophy perspective. And then I ended up studying theology at Oxford, sort of philosophical theology, I guess, but also trying to think about humans and human nature from a different perspective. So that kind of ties together the academic side. And then one other theme I would say is I'm always been interested in like applying ideas. I've always been frustrated when I'm just doing the idea side, like in the academy. And I want to combine it with practicality. So I see the School of Life as one example of a business that does that. They're based in Melbourne and London, around the world. And that's also why I joined Boston Consulting Group, to try to understand the practical side of things more. Basically, that's the journey I'm on, trying to do intellectual and practical as well.
Awesome. A lot of this podcast is focused on, redefining the game we're in, having different vantage points, getting out of that matrix. And obviously, imagination plays a critical role on that. You wrote a blog post called "The Biggest Forces That Shape Our Lives Are Imagination and Desire." Maybe can you elaborate on that, on how imagination shapes our lives, particularly when we get older? Because it seems that as we get older, imagination maybe does not have the same force as it did when we were younger.
Yeah, it's a great question. And just want to say also, I love the theme of the podcast. It's such a great idea, thinking about the game and, like, as you said, the matrix as well, the matrix and escaping it. I'm fascinated by that. And I think it really relates to the question of imagination, thinking about what shapes our lives. What often happens in our minds is that we get some image or a picture of something, and it can be quite small and even unformed. For example, like, let's say someone has the idea of career success, and they imagine being the top of a bank, and the kind of lifestyle that comes with that. Just having that little piece of imagination can do extraordinary things in their life. If they really believe that, if that draws them, if they have the desire, that they can, sacrifice decades of their lives working for a company, climbing up, doing all sorts of other things just for this one goal that they might not even think about very much. And often, obviously, what happens is you get there and it's not what you quite imagined. But I think there's a social element of this too, which is that society accepts certain images of success, obviously, and we absorb those. And so lots and lots of people have the dream of, like, being top of a corporation, or being a professor for other people maybe. And so breaking out of the matrix is partly like having your own image, imagining your own picture of success, and then figuring out how you can really desire that, devote yourself to it. And I think the default position is we just go along with the one society implants in our brain. And it is really hard to firstly think of your own idea of what would be great to do in life, and then really to follow that. It's a whole, the second part of your question is, as we get older, and I think there are many reasons why it gets harder to do that. You probably understand yourself,
Yeah.
like as I do. Like you get family and many other concerns. And I remember, when I was like 18, I had this idea that I wanted to ride my bike to Sydney from Melbourne. And I just remember thinking of it. I thought that'd be so cool. Like I imagined being out there on the bike, and then suddenly I was doing it on my summer holidays, and I just got on my bike and rode for like 14 days, and it
Yeah.
feels like when you're young, that's the kind of thing you do. But yeah.
Well, when you're young, you had your most vivid imaginations, right? You really, you think you could conquer the world, you have big dreams, but somewhere along the line, maybe like you mentioned, society kind of like beats that out of us, but we lose that faith in our imagination.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah. I think it's really hard to have that faith in yourself. It's just naturally hard. It's not like the default position is that we have faith in our own dream. It's a really difficult thing to do, and no one ever finds that easy, I think.
so in your studies, in terms of even theology, like how can people keep that imagination, in the world, especially I call it the matrix, because our self-worth and our identity kind of gets determined by stuff that's outside of us. I was reading a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he was talking about how habits shape us, and how there's 3 layers of habits. There's the outcome, there's the process, and there's the identity. So we're focused on the outcome, and the outcome could be getting that top position at your job or whatever, and obviously whatever the process that is. But because it's not in the identity, it's not a true goal. It feels empty once we get there, and especially now with social media, outcome-based goals, outcome-based habits are like prevalent, right? That because we see that all the time. How can somebody block out the matrix a little bit, and to kind of refocus on their identity or their imagination?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing to do is to like dive into your dream a little more. So thinking about like what is imagination? One way to define it is it's the capacity to create a mental model of a thing or a situation that doesn't yet exist. So compare us to like a goldfish, for example. The fish swims around in its tank, and its mental model of the world is just everything that's there already. It never thinks, okay, what would a different tank be like? It just deals with what's in front of it. Maybe that's like us in social media, and just taking on the goals that status gives us. But what we can do with imagination is we can say, oh, if I can imagine a different tank, with more seaweed or whatever a better tank would be. And you put together a mental model. It's like constructing a house. And if you want to believe in that, one thing that's really helpful to do is to do that very explicitly. So there's a lot of exercises that we can do, obviously, to sit down and like write out our dreams. One thing I do with, I have a business coach that as well, Jason Eisner. And one of the great exercises that he got me to do was to write down in real detail, like what it would be like if I had my ideal life, however long from now, 10, 20 years. But the key was doing it in absolute detail. Like you get up in the morning, what does it look like out the window? What do you do next? Like what shoes are you wearing? And the car you get into, where do you go to work? What exactly is the door like? What's on your desk? Painting the whole picture. And the reason of doing that is that you're fleshing out the mental model. So it's not just a little fragment in your head about, oh, I might do that. It's a real picture. And then, really entering into that picture, maybe like hearing it every day, returning to it, can help you kind of create your own mini world that you can believe in yourself. I think that's a great starting point.
In your background with neuroscience, I know that vision boards and kind of visualizing your success before you attain it is something that's commonly recommended. And I heard somewhere where, your mind doesn't know the difference between reality and, your dreams and all that. And if you could convince your mind that that is real, it will just work towards it as though it expects to get that.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Yeah, I would add that our minds are also wired to be social. So another part of it is recognizing just how difficult it is to break out of the socially accepted dreams that we get given. And it's always going to be hard. And I think just recognizing that it's hard is really helpful, because it helps us not beat ourselves up so much when it is hard to believe in the other dream. It's not as simple as like just telling your mind. You really have to persuade your mind that something is real. And you're fighting against big forces that are persuading you of other goals, like all the billboards and Instagram ads and everything that other people value. So it's in what you're actually doing in some ways is creating a new value, which is an interesting way to think about it. Like, we don't often use the word values, but all that means is some image of something that you value, that you want. And society has certain things that it wants, but creating your own one is like creating a new value. So for me, I want to start a company based around therapy. And what I have to do is like build this picture of that company and really value that and make that a central value in my life, which is really hard to do because there's a lot of competition from everything else.
So you mentioned therapy, and your bio also mentions that you had a transformational experience with therapy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I studied neuroscience and I was always skeptical of psychotherapy. And I read an article once by this philosopher in England called Alain de Botton. He's the one that runs the School of Life. And at the time, I was surprised because he was really advocating for psychotherapy. And I remember feeling a little more open to it after that article, even though I was pretty skeptical. But at some point, I just thought it would be really interesting to try it. I think someone described it to me it's not something medical. It's more like an exercise in gaining self-knowledge, almost like having a journal or painting a picture. It's more of a literary exercise in some ways, therapy. It's about reflecting on your life, thinking about who you are and what you want. So that kind of intrigued me, that way of thinking about it. And eventually just signed up for a therapist. I was in Oxford at the time, ended up doing it a lot. And, I'm a complete convert. When I think back to all the things that have influenced me, it's kind of like therapy is the only one that actually made a difference, I would say. So like, all of this education, great. Okay. It gives you lots of theories. It doesn't change you that much. I also kind of experimented with religion. I used to be a pretty strong atheist, and I kind of dived into religion in England, and I went to church sometimes every day, every once a week. But ultimately it was doing therapy, and I ended up doing therapy like 5 days a week for 3 years. Having that intense amount of contact with someone who was like extremely wise and insightful and thoughtful, it actually changes you. And I'm so enthusiastic about that possibility, because so few things can actually achieve that. Reading a book, you read it, gives you an idea, but do you really change your life? Like, it's very hard to change your life. But encountering a person every day who kind of drips little bits of wisdom into your mind, like drip, drip, drip over 3 years for 5 days a week, that actually seeps in. And so I'm really passionate about like expanding that practice, because I think it can actually change people and improve lives and society.
What were the connections to like imagination? Did he give you maybe more confidence to follow your dreams and visions, or did that lead to action?
Yeah, it was a woman. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that the whole experience focused me on was being more aware of my inner life, my own desires. ironically, when I arrived in Oxford, I was really keen to not be an individual. I was feeling kind of rebellious against the modern culture of everyone wanting to be individual. And I had this idea of immersing myself in these old traditions, hence the religion, but also like England and all of the history. But it was funny because the experience I actually had was with therapy, and I realized I was so unaware of myself before then. Not that I'm massively there now, but compared to what it was, I can actually notice what's going on inside me, which is so different. And it actually gave me the confidence to try to start this therapy business. At the time I had different ideas about what I was going to do. I basically wanted to join someone else's thing. But over time, it's really given me the ability to say, I'm going to do something myself, despite the fear of failure and everything. So that's a big difference. I couldn't have done that before.
Do they, because I know we talked before, and I'm taking a class at Yale online about the finding true happiness. And they talk a lot about what you talked about people wanting that big job, that big house, and how that does not really give you the happiness you're looking for. And so some of the tasks that they have us do are, journaling, maybe some, obviously that includes some self-reflection on there, some gratitude statements daily. My impression of therapy is, you talk to someone, they ask you questions, you kind of talk things out. But from that, were there any actionable items that you did that helped you give you that confidence to pursue your therapy opportunity?
Yeah, I guess you're wondering about like exercises that other people can do.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things, and I have the same issue actually. I tend to be a big reader, but in the beginning, I was just that. I was just a reader, and I didn't necessarily put into action. I said, like, these are great steps, these are great advice, but then I wouldn't act on them, right? I would just know of them. So I think one of the biggest thing for us is we might have imagination, but we don't take actionable steps to get anywhere close to that.
Yeah, I guess there are a couple of things there. One is like, how can you implement therapy? And the other one is like, how do you follow your imagination? How do you follow your dream? I think with therapy, I think that it did change me. Like, it changed the way my mind works. So in some ways, that all my actions have changed. I'm much less anxious. I'm much more aware. Like, I've made so many different kinds of plans. I probably wouldn't have met my wife, for example, if it wasn't for therapy. I met her in a cafe, and I literally just come out of the therapy session, and we've been talking about like how difficult it is for me to follow my own desire, especially around like romance. I get a desire, and my mind immediately used to push it away almost before I even noticed. I think it was worse than it is for other people, perhaps. It was pretty hard. Anyway, I'd been slowly working on this, and I walked into the cafe, and there's this attractive girl there, and I thought, just for once, I'm going to actually act on this. And I walked up to her and I was like, do you mind if I share your table? And so we got talking and ended up dating. And then she was American, and that, took me eventually, well, part of the reason was, came to America. So completely changed my life. So in some ways, the effect of that deep influence over many years has had many action implications for my whole life. But there's another kind of aspect to your question, I think, which is like, what tasks can we do that can help with this sort of stuff? And I said one of them before, I think, which was like the visioning exercise of really fleshing out your mental model of what you want, of what you're imagining. I think another one is actually, this might sound too meta, but it's like acting. So, just doing one thing that is possible on that goal. This has probably been said by many people, but I think it's a very important point, which is you just need to do one small thing, even if it's tiny, because that will get things started, and then things start rolling. So like whatever it is, just do it. And my favorite philosopher Goethe, the German poet. He said, I can't remember the exact. Sorry, that was my cat. You can edit that out. Apologies about that. Yeah, so Goethe said this line. He said, act first and then the world opens up to you. In the beginning was the act. So it can really affect your brain to just do something along the lines of your vision, because then it makes it a little more real. And then you start to build up a structure around you in your life that supports it. Like I imagine for your podcast, that started as an idea, right? As an imagination at some point.
Yes, and actually, it did start as an idea, and I would talk. I'll be honest with you. One of the big reasons why I started this podcast is because I would talk to my kids and stuff, and they wouldn't. They would just like shrug, and they're young still. My oldest is only 14, but I said I'm going to do this podcast and really share these ideas because I want them to have something to look back to. And for me, it just helps me flesh out what Jason talked about. It helps me flesh out what I really want, because you have this idea. Let me do it and figure out if I still want to do it, number one, and number two, if I do, what are how does it look like for real? So
yeah, well that's great advice as usual from Jason. Yeah, I think, that's right. You got to experiment. You got to throw yourself into it. And I think we find this hard as individuals and as corporations too. Like the work I'm doing at BCG, we're writing about how companies find this hard to experiment, to act, to throw yourself into it and then see, rather than like trying to determine everything up front.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to my next question, because you wrote an article called Competing on Imagination. And it was really directed more towards business, but you did have some actionable steps. There were seven things you talked about. Can you maybe talk about the top 3 from the 7?
Yeah, sure. I guess you can think of it in terms of blocks and enablers. So the top 3 blocks, I think, to imagination in companies. One is the idea of legitimacy. So often companies will want to see some kind of financial model of an idea before they're willing to take it seriously. But with imagination, it actually starts as a very personal thing. So it's often even just one individual who has an idea. And it's very hard for companies to take that seriously. An example is, my college in Oxford. I had this idea that they could buy whole different kinds of like fittings for like doorknobs and everything. I just felt that they were buying cheap stuff and there was ways to do it that was better, that didn't cost a lot more. Anyway, I thought it was a great idea. And I went to the head of, whatever, and she said to me, we can't really act on this unless you get like a petition of students, and there are all these hurdles. And for them, the hurdle, like the legitimacy was based on democracy. It was like, you need enough people who want this for us to do something. In companies, it's based on finance. Like we need to know, this idea needs to be well developed enough to know how much money it would make for us to like really take it seriously. So one challenge is taking something seriously that's just an individual idea.
Is there companies that you know of that maybe don't have that blocker?
Oh yeah, there are some great examples. Like one of the best ones is a company that not many people have heard of. It's called Recruit. The full name is Recruit Holdings. It's a Japanese company. They own a huge number of companies. Like I think someone described them as like LinkedIn plus Twitter plus Glassdoor, and they also own a whole lot of real estate. So they're a huge company, and they're really good at intrapreneurship, as they call it. So they have a system where if you're an employee in any department, you can email this group with an idea, and the barriers are very low to getting funding and getting started. So this internal group will hook you up with other members who are interested in the idea. They'll post it on a forum. You can get like a small amount of funding very quickly, like a few $100s or a few $1,000s. And then there are obviously like steps of funding and support, but it's not hard to move up them, and it's not hard to get on that ladder. And the other thing they're really good at doing is they have these massive events once a year which celebrate everyone who's thinking of ideas and turns them into heroes. So like they stand up on stage, they talk about their idea, even if it's not fully worked out yet, and everyone claps. It's like a huge thing, lights, big audience, and the whole point, they say, is not really for the ideas themselves, it's for the people in the audience to tell them, you can do this too.
Awesome.
And out of this program has come a lot of new businesses that they've founded, and obviously they get the reward because someone has a great business idea, they invest in it, they own the equity, they make the profit. So it's a great system they have. Another American example is Zappos, and you've heard of them, Tony Hsieh. They have a very different business model entirely in terms of their organizational structure, but it's hugely decentralized. So their motto is, we interviewed them for the book, and Tony Hsieh, or what his someone in his team actually said that their motto is, in most companies, it takes only one no. So only one person has to say no to kill the idea. At Zappos, it takes only one yes to get it started. So everyone has their own budget that they control, and just one person has to say, yeah, that sounds cool, I'll pay for it with my own budget. And that's all you need to get an idea off the ground. So that's awesome for encouraging like imaginative experimentation.
I'm curious if you interviewed Google for your book.
No, we didn't. Not the heads of Google, but we did interview the head AI researcher at Google, who was fascinating. Because we were interested in, like, can AI be creative as well? So we had a great conversation around that.
Well, I only asked that because obviously I have a technology background, and they have one of the best entrepreneurship type of environment where they'll give every engineer 20% time to work on whatever they want.
Yeah, that's right.
They will pay for the resources, they'll pay for classes, books, whatever they want to work on, they can work on it. And when they want to bring it to their team, they'll develop it. And if it's, if they think it's worthwhile. And I'm not sure people realize just how many ideas that Google has brought to the market were from that program.
Yeah, definitely. I think Gmail came out of it.
Gmail, the auto-populating of searches when you're typing in and kind of that was brought out of, there's a lot of AI, the Google Sketch, Google like visual shapes, all came out of somebody just working on whatever they want to work on.
Yeah, and I imagine a big contribution is almost the mythology around the 20% time, even if the time itself is not always effective. It's the fact that they have that, and that everyone, like, in the company and many people outside know about it. It creates a feeling, that we can be scrappy, we can think of new ideas. And I think that probably permeates their culture, would be my guess, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever been to Google, but Google is, all of their walls are like whiteboards. So you can like stop and talk about ideas, and they have all kinds of speakers that they welcome engineers to do. And so it's a great environment for just bouncing ideas and
yeah, that's great. I just wanted to come back because I didn't finish my top three, but I'll go through them quickly. So yeah, I think top one is giving legitimacy to ideas. And second one is understanding what an early stage idea looks like, that it might be quite weird at the beginning. So there's a story of Jony Ive, who used to be the head designer at Apple, who basically designed all of their hit products. They have a core design team. And what that team is really good at doing is listening to ideas when they're in a really, speculative, almost bizarre early stage. Like, they were sitting around trying to think of a new idea for a computer, and someone was like, I've been thinking about like eggs recently, like the egg shape. I don't know, it's just cool. and if you said that in a normal boardroom meeting or something, it would be like, what the hell are you talking about? But they worked with it, and that was actually the beginning of the that iMac they made with those colored, it's the first computer to look like an egg.
That's right.
So you got to understand, like, ideas can start in a bizarre place. And then the third one is not assessing and rewarding imagination as a key skill. I think, companies aren't systematic enough about imagination. They see it as a kind of romantic thing that is mysterious, that arrives on people. It's actually, it's a capacity in everyone's brain, and you have to measure it and reward it for people who are good at it. Like Boston Consulting Group measures a whole set of skills for every project we do, including efficiency, communication, analytic ability, all of that. You just add imagination to that. Like, how good at this was this person at drawing analogies? You could have a whole set of sub skills, how good were they at noticing an anomaly rather than the average, and like thinking of an interesting conclusion from that anomaly. How good were they at like creating a range of different ideas and possibilities. There's a whole set of criteria you could create and assess people on. Do you want me to tell you the top 3 things to do as well?
Yes.
Okay, these are a bit more personal as well. I think they go for companies and people.
Okay.
The first one is, so we wrote an article in Harvard Business Review recently called "Imagination is More Important Now Than Ever." So talking about the coronavirus time.
Yeah.
And the top thing to do is create time for reflection, which is pretty hard if, you know, you're managing a crisis, as a lot of people are at the moment. You know, but it's really important. And most of the time in business and in life, probably, we operate with our fight or flight nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. That's the one that amps you up, you know, lasers your focus into a target, gets you onto a goal. But there's another parallel nervous system called the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest as opposed to fight or flight. And that's the system that comes into play when you're eating, you're relaxing, you're chilling out. And actually, imagination seems to be associated with that second state, you know, because it's more about broad thinking, speculation. So creating time for that in your life, which could be going for a walk without your phone, could be playing or listening to some music. Yeah, it could be just taking time over a meal, you know, like the old tradition of long lunches might actually be good for imagination. Second thing to do is to play and recognize the value of play. And play is basically just improvised behavior. So it's doing stuff that just comes to your head as opposed to something planned. So even if you're just having a playful conversation where you just toss out ideas, maybe you're joking, you're bantering, or you're just throwing out an idea, doing that is really good practice for imagination. You know, it creates, gives permission for people to play as well.
Yeah.
And then the third one I would say is investing in experimentation. So at the company level, it's really important, even when you're in a crisis, especially when you're in a crisis, to invest in experiments, even if they're just like cheap experiments. And there are a lot of examples of companies doing this during difficult times. So Lego, for example, was around the Second World War. The Lego factory burnt down, and he was just a single operator back then. But even despite that, he invested in a whole new plastic toy manufacturing machine, which no one had done before. He spent the company's entire year profits on this one machine around like just after the war. And of course, like that eventually led to Lego, but he wasn't afraid to invest in experimenting. And it's the same with us personally. You know, it's difficult to act on ideas that you might have to imagine and believe and then act. But that's what we got to invest in doing.
So I have a couple of questions actually from your top 3 list. And the biggest question I have is, especially for companies. So obviously Google, Zappos, the Japanese recruiting firm, highly successful companies. The steps of their success are obviously open to go research. People normally copy success in their steps. Why hasn't this been adopted more?
I think it's many reasons. One is that like the whole idea of corporations is not based around imagination. You know, corporations were invented maybe in the 17th century in Europe, and the whole idea, like, you know, Adam Smith articulated, was to divide and conquer, to create specialized roles in order to scale up and produce something at scale. So they've always been about standardization and scale and efficiency. And it's worked really well. That works really well when you have a great idea, like making a car for Ford, you know, and it's a model that is going to be sustained. It doesn't work well when you need to change your business model or you need to adapt. But companies, since their beginning, they're not oriented around that. The idea, it's very hierarchical. The idea is to come in and you fill a role and you contribute to the business model. So that's one piece of inertia that holds companies back from doing it. Another is just human nature, I think. Like it is hard to do these things. I think we also naturally fall into fulfilling a role. We like it. It limits things. You know, we have a job, we go home. It's nice. We've got other priorities in our life for many people. And so that's the situation for all companies. And you actually need to create very intelligent, well-designed processes to try to encourage imagination and to make people think it's really worth it to have an idea in the company. You know, that your bosses aren't just going to laugh at you or just think it's a waste of time. So there's a natural inertia as well in people, and it's the same at an individual level. By default, we fall into society's pattern. And so even though we can see and we can cognitively understand how some people might have got out of it, it's very hard to do. And not hard in an intellectual sense, an emotional sense, I think. You know, the second thing in your backdrop there is believe, you know, imagine, believe, achieve.
Yeah.
And the believe, as we've talked about a couple of times, it's hard. So I think we can see it, but we got to practice it.
I am studying a little bit of imagination, and what prevents us from doing that maybe, and a lot of it could be fear of failure. How does that play a role into the reluctance to take that leap into imagination?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, fear of failure is one of those things that we hear, and it's like a cliche term almost. It's a very good term. But I think when I think about it, say in my own life, I'm trying to start this business. What is my fear of failure? It kind of doesn't appear to me as a fear of failure. It just, there's something in me that makes me reluctant. And it's almost like I have to notice it in retrospect. You know, when I'm feeling all enthusiastic about the goal, I'll go and do stuff, I'll have a great day. But then I realize, oh, for like 5 days, I just haven't done that yet. And it's like, it actually blocks me before it even gets to my consciousness somehow. Like it's an aversion, a kind of deep aversion to doing this. And I think then that's fear. It doesn't come as a nice little package saying, I'm stopping you from doing this. Like, do you want that? You know, it takes over and kind of turns you away from the thing before you've even had time to reflect on it. So I think there's this deep fear it's very hard to get over. That's why it's so good to talk to people like you, or to have a business coach or a therapist, because they can help you notice that and work through it bit by bit and keep coming back to the task. But I would also change the term slightly. I would say it's not just failure. Like, you know, that's part of it, because we can fear, oh, I might try this, I might end up being a loser, I might have wasted my life. But often that fear is there anyway. Like we fear, oh, I'm in the wrong job, I'm wasting my life. But there is a kind of fear of doing something different. There's a fear of difference. And it's often like doing something different from what your family was used to, say. You know, like my family hasn't been very entrepreneurial. No one that I grew up with has like founded their own company. And those were all the patterns of life that really influenced me early on. You know, people have been an architect. There's a lot of creativity, but like a drawer, all sorts of things. But if you grew up, you know, surrounded by people where it was just normal to start a company, then the fear wouldn't be there. So there's a big fear of being different, especially from the background that you come from. And I think it's a very hard thing to just get over. You can't make it go away. But I think a good step is to at least acknowledge it. You know, then at least you can objectify it a bit and see this is a block.
Absolutely. I actually have 2 more questions regarding that, because I heard a quote that says people overestimate what they could do in a year and underestimate what they could do in 10 years. And so we have this, I'm going to take this podcast, and if I don't have 1 million followers by next week, forget it. It didn't work. Instead of like, well, this is the first podcast, let me work through this. Let me see what works, what doesn't work. And I think that companies, you know, in that Simon Sinek video, What Game We're Really In, he talks about how Apple's in the game of just being the best product to help educators, to help, you know, the public and so forth. They're not really looking at technology. They're not in the technology game. They're in the convenience game. Just happening to use technology to do that. And I think that companies sometimes think I'm in the make profits for this quarter game, instead of saying I'm in the game of, bringing innovative products to help people.
Yeah,
And I think that sometimes we think, I'm a big believer in self growth and just going through that. And these are just parts of it. I'm not in the business of being the best engineer or the best podcast host. I'm just going to grow through this and, become better from this. And yeah, I'm going to make mistakes. I wouldn't learn if I did not have those mistakes. So I'm good with that. But how can we change the paradigm for businesses, or I think more, or even personal, to take a step back, a different vantage point, and say, maybe refine what game you're in?
absolutely. This is a great metaphor. And I think if you think about a game, a big part that defines it is the goal, in a way. Like, soccer is defined by kicking the ball in the goal. Like, that's the aim. Everything's oriented around that. And then there are obviously rules. So I think a big part is, what is the goal? What's the vision of success we're aiming for? And Apple, or the companies you're talking about, they reframed that. They're like, we're not aiming to do X, we're aiming to do Y, really. We're not in the game of making a quarterly profit. We're in the game of, maybe building a beautiful company, over 50 years. So changing the goal, which is another way of saying the value, the imagination that you hold up, the vision, the imagined vision that you value, holding up the right one is really important. And I think the way we can think about this is through Aristotle. Like, he thought about this a lot, the philosopher, and he said, we have a lot of goals in life, and some of them are means to ends. Like, I do this job to make money in order to X, to do what? And you keep asking, in order to do what? In order to do what? In order to do what? And what do you get to in the end? Like, what is the goal of all of this? And he gave it the word, it's well known, but flourishing, or happiness. It's different translations, but living in a state of, expanding yourself and living a good life. That's the goal. And that sounds obvious, but we don't actually live like that. We live as though the game we're in is getting to the top of this company. That's the actual thing we're striving for, even if we might not say that to ourselves. So to really say, like, what is my game? The game is to flourish. And I think a great unexpected place. I mentioned this before, but we can actually look to British aristocrats for some advice here. And I think they're a great example because, aristocrats, like, for the last few hundred years, they've had all the money and status sorted out. They haven't needed to get more status. They haven't needed more money. They've got a beautiful house, like social position, lots of friends. So obviously there are many people who didn't do this, but a lot of them, they just want to enjoy life. They just want to flourish. And so their life revolved around just projects that they did. They loved gardening, so they built like a beautiful big garden, or they wanted to go on a trip through Europe, so they just went on it for like 5 years. And it was whatever came to them, whatever felt would fulfill them as humans. Not striving in a career, but just trying to do projects in order to flourish. And I think it's very possible to do that. And your podcast seems to be an example of that. Like, you're doing it to grow, to just expand yourself, to live more richly. And those are things that we should absolutely value above all else, I think.
Actually, I love that quote by Aristotle, because I tell people all the time that once you define what you want, so for example, people talk about, being wealthy financially, and what that really means. What that really probably means is not that you have the car, it's that you have freedom. You have freedom, you don't not tied to a job, you have freedom to do and explore and your hobbies. So once you realize maybe that's the end game, there's a lot of different ways you can make that happen. It doesn't have to always be kill myself for my job. I could probably do other things and still get that end game somehow.
Exactly, yeah. And it sounds like you're doing a really good service to help us reflect on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great benefit for me as well. So it gets a good reminder for myself. And then the other question I had for you in terms of this conversation, I'm just curious. There's another quote that I heard about leveraging behavior, not trying to change it. So do you use social media and things that people are already on to maybe give some therapy to that, to maybe give people pause to reflect on things that they could do to use imagination more in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't do it very successfully, but like I would love to be doing that. I try to do that. I think absolutely. I think, you know, all kinds of media, you should use whatever gets to people where they are. I absolutely think that, you know, back in like the 1100s in medieval Europe, the big media was like writing a poem. You know, if you wrote a big poem, it was going to have massive impact, you know.
Yeah.
Probably giving a sermon as well was the other one, or doing a painting. Maybe in the Renaissance, that was the equivalent of like making a big film. And those genres got great minds to do incredible examples of work within them. But today we have new genres like film, social media, probably virtual reality. You know, just engaging with a website even is kind of art. And I want to take all those classical ambitions of helping people flourish and helping us rethink what game we're in, but do that through the channels that exist today, in the most, you know, gripping way possible. I just feel, yeah, it's quite hard. Like I post something on Twitter and one person likes it. As you said, though, it's like, you know, we underestimate the 10 years maybe.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's not who likes it; it's the right person that likes it. Because, you know,
That's a nice way of thinking about it.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
no, it's a definite struggle, and I think that social media and all this really makes it more complicated because it's a constant comparison, you know. And I think you evaluate your life constantly on social media, and the media itself. So I think self-reflection is huge. I think we don't really do that enough. Um,
yeah. I'm starting an Instagram account for my company. It'll be Different Light Co.
okay,
And so the idea there will be to have posts that help people reflect. You know, even though Instagram is a status-focused medium, we're going to try and create like thoughtful mini essays and images.
awesome. Um, you know, just talking about what you mentioned earlier about videos, I think people underestimate also videos on YouTube and even music
Mm,
that are huge. That get people to really act on emotion, which people don't really realize means energy and emotion. And
absolutely.
it's something that we really need to do to give us that courage, right? To start to live with imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah, movies and music are the two biggest things that shape our lives. I think emotionally, they're just so, both of them are so hard to do from the perspective of, you know, someone who's not in that already. If only
Absolutely.
it could be a famous musician or a famous director. So yeah.
And there's a lot of parallels between business and personal, and I feel that sometimes because the people running these businesses are obviously people and they don't have that in their lives, it makes it hard to transfer that vision to their business. What are some of the biggest parallels that you've seen in terms of personal and business and using imagination?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one example is, I mentioned him, Alain de Botton, who runs the School of Life. Um, you know, he is a pretty popular philosopher, not so much in America, but he's written about 15 sort of very popular books based on philosophy. And he's really converted that into a company called the School of Life, which is a very experimental company trying out a lot of different ways of reaching people with wisdom. But I think he's got a great alignment between what he cares about personally and what he's trying to do in the world. You know, it's a very hard thing to do, especially at a very large scale. Um, um, you know, there are companies like Patagonia that people know where the founder is still involved and creates an ethos for the company. Oh, a good company actually is called Arup. It's in the architecture world, ARUP. It's from Europe, and they're a pretty big company, but they're still foundation or family owned. And the founder's statement is still like read by every new recruit, and they have a real ethos and philosophy of committing to the long-term work. And it feels like they've managed to align, you know, some personal goals of doing good in the world with a business. Are those the kind of things you're thinking about, or?
Yeah, I think someone that really lives that philosophy, it's going to transfer obviously into business, and it's going to that vision is going to be in the business, um,
Yeah.
and and also they're going to encourage employees and people in there to have that same,
Yeah.
vision.
Well, Tony Hsieh, for example, is a great instance of this. He's a very experimental thinker and very imaginative, and because he runs Zappos, he just decided to transform the whole company the way that it does business, and they're the most experimental company on the planet, probably, the way that they run themselves. So if you have someone who's determined, who has the power, and in a business, you can do a lot. I think if we can get people flowing into businesses who are thinking the way that we're talking about, like wanting flourishing to be the overall goal and trying to help others do that, that will transform businesses. We get into positions of influence, we can shape them. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest issues, because one of the reasons that I started this podcast and things of that nature is just because I just wanted to live out loud. I just wanted to live by design. I just didn't want there to be like I live my personal life this way and I live my business life this way. I wanted it just to be one life. Um, but in doing so, I've learned that, imagination, which is experimentation, we don't have all the answers and we get a lot of things wrong. And you have to be vulnerable to saying, yeah, that didn't work, or I don't know, I'm just going to try it. And I think people have a hard time being vulnerable that way. I know I had struggles in being vulnerable and being able to say to my close ones, I don't know how to do it, or I was wrong on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a pathology of big companies too. It's very hard to get past that.
Yeah.
Elon Musk seemed to do that pretty well, where he'll make mistakes and he just seems to push on. He'll admit that they're mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up the podcast, I think that we're all looking for some tips to live through imagination. I call it living by design. The matrix is the default. Live by design is what you want to do, your imagination. Is there like 3 top tips that you can share with us as to how we can move towards that?
Sure. I guess my first one is like looking into your dreams. I know this sounds perhaps non-consequential, but actually, if you can look into your dreams deeply enough, which is not easy to do, there is a lot of helpful material in there that will give you confidence, and it often expresses parts of yourself that you haven't really accessed yet. If you're a shy person, you might have dreams that can tell you about other parts of yourself that you haven't lived out, but that are waiting there in potential. It's very hard to do though without someone who can guide you through it. Like I do it with my therapist, and I find it mind expanding to do that. But I think even just writing them down, reflecting on them can be great. Drawing out some of the symbols that come up in your dreams, that can be really helpful. Second one, I would say read some philosophy that we've been talking about. So I think like reading Aristotle's Ethics. Don't feel you have to read the whole thing, just sampling bits that look interesting. There's a great chapter on friendship, looking up, where he talked about flourishing or eudaimonia. That's a great starting point. I would also recommend a book on Goethe that got me thinking along these lines. It's not a well-known book at all, but it's called Life, Love, Goethe. And it's a great description of like Goethe's life, because it's not so much his works, it's how he lived that is what can teach us so much. And he basically lives out what Aristotle is talking about. So it's a great example. And the third one I would say is also a kind of classical philosophy point, which is, self-knowledge, like that old idea of know thyself. I think we have so much more in us than we realize. Our consciousness is just a small part of our brain activity in the whole body. Most stuff that we are is not conscious yet, but there's a lot that goes on within us that we can make more conscious, that we can connect to, and that will, as the phrase goes, expand our consciousness. We're on the West Coast, so we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think as you learn more about yourself, what you're conscious of in yourself gets bigger. So that's an expansion of consciousness. And in many ways to do that. For me, I mentioned like going to psychodynamic therapy. Like I think there are different kinds of therapy, but the one where you deeply reflect on who you are and what's inside you, that can really help with that. But learning self-knowledge is so foundational because you are like the machine that's going to do all this stuff. So you want to know how it works, everything about it. And, it'd be great if we had everyone in society thought that this is very normal to spend a lot of time getting to know yourself. But we can be pioneers at this point and
Absolutely. And I imagine you're going to have some like some snippets of those books in the Instagram posts, and it really kind of entice people to read more about it.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Well, it was great to have you on, Jack.
Thanks so much,
a big fan of the work you do. So stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
In this coronavirus era that we live in.
Yes.
And thank you for all you do. And we're definitely looking forward to seeing more of your work on social media. I definitely will be following it and promoting it on my channel. So
thanks so much. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Jack.